My name is Elise Janz from Calgary, Alberta, Canada, and I am currently in the Youth Development concentration for the Masters of Urban Studies through Eastern University. This is my video presentation on my thesis, which is entitled The Resilient Student, Teachers' Perspectives on the Phenomena of Resilience in Alternative Educational Programs. Two reasons that I selected this area of research. The first was that I am a teacher in a program with high needs and high risk students. And secondly, because one of my career goals in life is actually to develop an alternative program. And so I decided to look closely at some of the resiliency frameworks that are in use and teachers' perceptions of how these adjust and support students that are at risk for dropping out of school. While I will not provide a comprehensive list of all the key concepts utilized in my thesis, I do want to highlight three specific definitions from the glossary that will help with the understanding of outcomes and analysis of data. So the first one is educational resilience, which refers to a heightened chance students will succeed in school goals in spite of adversity in their environment, traits, conditions, and experiences. And that comes from the work of Allen and Morrison in their 2007 research. The second one is self-reliance, a belief that one has the capacity and agency to change their circumstances, that current action will have future impacts, and that comes from the 2014 works of Casalina. And alternative programming refers to specific school programming or separate classes that help assist students in achieving the goals of the curriculum in a way that meets their needs and accommodates their learning styles. And this comes from the 1999 work of Sprague and Tobin. My central research question guiding this project was, how do secondary high school teachers in Calgary alternative educational programs experience, initiate, and interact with the phenomena of student resiliency as a factor in attaining high school graduation requirements? To break that down, I was looking specifically at-risk learner groups, in particular, special needs learners, Indigenous learners, and English language learners, in order to see if resiliency frameworks were supporting these groups that are most likely to drop out of high school early and therefore not attain their high school graduation requirements. Some of the sub-questions that I looked into were, to what extent do teachers understand and utilize the educational framework of resilience? What ways do teachers work to instill resilience in their students? What ways do teachers perceive the phenomena of resilience impacting students' ability to meet high school outcomes? How do teachers define resilient youth? What ways, if any, do teachers see entry points for resiliency teaching in set curriculums? What coping strategies do students engage in order to bounce back? And what characteristics of resiliency do teachers experience students exhibiting? Due to the fact that I wanted to study how individual teachers saw resiliency functioning in both their program and practice, I decided to use the phenomenological paradigm of constructivism, which, according to Savin, Batten, and Major, works to understand the differing ways in which people experience and apprehend various phenomena of the world. Through the process, I interviewed 5 participants, all of which had or were currently working in alternative programming with the student groups that I had outlined in the previous slide. These groups included Indigenous students, English language learners, and special needs learners. The interview took between 60 to 90 minutes and included 3 specific sections. The first section looked at teacher engagement with resiliency frameworks. The section focused on teachers' perception of student resilience. And the third section was if teachers saw students demonstrate resiliency outcomes that were modeled and taught in their class programs. After completing the interview process and then subsequently transcribing each of the interviews, I decided to keep the 3 sections of the interview separate and therefore develop themes from each of these sections. For the preliminary section of the interview, which focused on teachers' use of resiliency frameworks, both within their practice and program, I found that many teachers, while they could list off the trainings that they had with resiliency frameworks, expressed a certain amount of hesitancy around use of these frameworks in their practice and program. This means that ultimately, while the training showed that teachers had this sort of professional development, they couldn't actually put in words in their narrative how they utilized these frameworks. However, a second thematic that emerged was the idea of personal narrative. I found that teachers who had experienced resiliency in their own lives were better able to communicate how they modeled resiliency for their at-risk learner groups in their own classrooms. A third thematic that emerged in the preliminary section of the interview was the idea of communal supports. Although not all of the teachers had equal access to community supports, they all cited that it was a vital piece of instilling resiliency in their student populations. Many students face barriers outside of the school walls that teachers cannot adequately support them with. Things such as food security, housing needs, and therapy are all supported by communal groups. When students have access to these, barriers that impede academic success are decreased. A fourth thematic that emerged from the first section of the interview, and one that showed to be discrepant among the teacher groups, was the idea of cultural connection. For teachers that come from the dominant norm, cultural connection is not something that is currently on radar. If it becomes a prominent issue, it is something that they stumble upon, or it is a crisis that they deal with after the case. For teachers from minority groups, cultural connection is extremely important for increasing student resilience. What they stated was that cultural connection increases students' sense of identity, and this identity informs their self-worth, and self-worth increases student engagement in their academic courses. The second section of the interview, which focused on teachers' perceptions of how student resiliency works within a classroom, focused on two thematics. One was time. Since students are facing significant barriers in their lives, much time is needed to model and instill resilience in these student demographics. The second one was relationship. Students won't engage in resilience unless they are in spaces where solid and secure relationships are formed with teachers. The final section of the interview, and the one that focused on students' abilities to use attributes of resiliency to overcome barriers in their academic goals, outlined two specific thematics. One was support. Many of the teachers noted that while students could exhibit resiliency, they actually couldn't do so individually and needed constant teacher support to engage in these attributes. The second, and the one that sort of answers my central research question, was the idea of individualized outcomes. Resiliency in classrooms doesn't necessarily mean that students meet all their goals for attaining an academic diploma or certificate. What it does mean is that they will work towards whatever goal best suits their life at the time. Some students won't actually make it through high school, but teachers work hard to demonstrate a different way that they can find success as citizens in society. To demonstrate my key findings, I developed a concept map that represented the themes from each section of my data analysis. My first concept map was entitled Instilling Resilience, Teacher Engagement. For me, what I found is that teachers are more likely to engage with resilience if they have a personal narrative around resilience themselves. This increases their sense of empathy. Empathy informs how much they are going to engage with resiliency frameworks that are part of their professional development. These frameworks cannot work in isolation, rather, they are supported by community, both within and outside of the school. Additionally, culturally adaptive curriculum and training of teachers is essential to ensure resilience is a common attribute that students demonstrate. The second concept map I created is entitled Student Engagement in Resiliency Factors. What I found was that teachers perceived that students with at-risk factors had increased chance of graduating if they had flexible graduation timeframes. Students who are labeled at risk have to invest considerable time in developing supportive teacher relationships. This helps them mitigate the risk, and therefore they then can invest in coping skills to increase their capacity to navigate barriers. This all has to be done before they can adequately engage in the academic work, and therefore they need increased time or flexible graduation timeframe to increase their capacity to meet graduation requirements. The third concept map I created, entitled Teacher Experience, Resilience Attributes in Students, reflected that trauma, chaotic environment, and disenfranchisement increased risk in students. This created maladaptive coping mechanisms. Resiliency frameworks help teachers move students towards their individual goals. However, there needs to be additional supports at both the level of barriers outside of school, so those are trauma, the chaotic environment, and disenfranchisement, as well as additional supports to shift individual student goals to goals of graduation. And this might actually need more support than a teacher can offer inside an alternative program. Some of the limits of my study include the limited number of interviewees that I worked with. I only interviewed 5 teachers, and I had originally anticipated interviewing between 10 and 15 teachers. Additionally, I only had participants from the public school boards, and time was a significant interruption for this process, as teachers were very busy, and many of my interviews collided with report card time, which again significantly impacted the number of people that I could draw from. Finally, I think for further research, you would need more diverse selection of teachers from a variety of boards, a greater understanding of how trauma informed practice is used at the classroom level, and research on the barriers outside of school that impede resilience in the classroom.